All right, and now we will get started. I'm going to do a few little announcements here. This is Amy Gamber. I'm the Commercial Services Manager at the Texas Association of Realtors. Many of you know me. And welcome to our webinar this morning. This webinar is available for CE credit, but only if you are at a local board office or some other proctored location. You cannot receive CE credit for this webinar if you're at home watching in your pajamas, or even if you are at work watching in your work clothes, and I'm sorry, but those are the TREC rules. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type them into the question box, and I will be following along with that. I can alert Peggy to any questions as they come up. It might be something that we wait till the end of the presentation, but we will do our best to get everybody's questions answered. This webinar will be recorded, and I should be able to post a link to the recording by the end of the week. If you have technical issues with Zoom, please do not call TAR or me or email us, because we don't run this platform and we don't have the resources to address your technical problems. But I am going to give you the phone number for Zoom so that you can call them if you need to. And the phone number for Zoom is 888-799-9666, extension 2. And again, I can't see Arlington. Do you guys have your video on? Our presenter today is Peggy Jones. Peggy has been a licensed Texas broker since 2006 with a primary focus on commercial real estate. She is a TAR member and also a member of our commercial committee. She received her BAAS and Master of Geography in Land Area Development and Management from Texas State University. Peggy has built 2 RV parks and currently owns and manages 3 apartment properties. She's married with 2 grown sons. She enjoys all modes of transportation, from horseback to boating to being the only female aircraft owner based in San Marcos. Peggy, we're really, really grateful that you could do this morning. And I'm going to hand it over to you. Take it.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be here. This has been an issue for me, and I want to share what I've learned in the process with other people so that they don't have the same issues going forward. And so with that, I'm going to start the video, I believe, and if I have technical difficulties, please forgive me in advance. Aha, the host has stopped it.
No, I didn't.
It says
Stopped.
Well, let's see. What do we do?
Okay, hang on. Okay, now go.
Okay, and I click start video, right?
Yes.
Ha.
There's you.
There we go.
Bingo.
Oh yeah, the fun one. Yeah.
That volume is quite low.
Well, this isn't going to play forever. They've just been singing about it since 1920, though, so this has been an ongoing problem. This is Louis Armstrong, if anyone is interested. So with that, we'll move on along. So FEMA defines the flood zones as a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres, normally dry land area, or 2 or more properties, at least one of which is your property, from overflow of inland or tidal water, from unusual and rapid accumulation or runoff from surface waters, from any source, or from mud flow. And we have a number of zones. A lot of people may not know about these, so I'm going to go over them. Zone V is closest to the coast. Zone A is generally close to the coast, and it ranges from Zone A, Zone AE, and Zone A's that are numbered. Now, the difference between Zone A and Zone AE, because this is a very common way of seeing this, Zone A means that it's in the 100-year floodplain. It's got a 1% annual chance of a flood event. And this means that they have not done a hydraulic analysis. If it simply says Zone A, the analysis and the base flood elevations have not been established. However, you are required to have flood insurance if there's a loan on the property. Zone AE means it's in the 100-year floodplain with a 1% annual chance flood event, but it means that they have made the determination and that they have established the base flood elevations. And of course, mandatory flood insurance is required. Now, something that is similar to AAE is the special flood hazard area. So you might see the SFHA. It is also in the 1% and meaning the 100-year floodplain. And of course, flood insurance is required. So the place you get out of flood insurance is Zone X, and Zone X actually replaced Zone B and C. And this is known as the 500-year floodplain, and that means that you have a 0.2% chance of flooding in any given year. So the flood insurance study is rather confusing. So they come in and they come into the community, and this is FEMA coming in, and they work with the local government, and they determine what flood hazards are for an area. They do an engineering study, and the FIS study shows the shallow flood areas, the flood hazard areas along the rivers, streams, coasts, and lakes. It's based on a different amount of information, and that includes historic information such as the river flow, the storm tide, and the rainfall data. It includes meteorological data, topographic data, hydrologic data, hydraulic data. Hydrologic data is the actual stream flow. Hydrologic is how high it gets. It looks at the open space conditions, how the water flows across open areas, any flood control works like levees, and of course the development in the area. And so of course this has to be updated over time. The results are shown on the FEMA flood map called the Flood Insurance Rate Maps, or FIRMs. And the FIRMs are available through the FEMA web service. We have a couple of different hazards that we track. This one is known as river flooding. Is anyone present that can tell me where this was?
Trinity River in Dallas.
It is. It's fairly recent. It's May 2015. And this is river flooding, and it occurs when the rivers receive more water that they can accommodate. And per FEMA rules, it could also be because of snow melt and ice jams. I don't suppose we have that problem. So, and it's just excessive rainfall filling up the rivers. You know where this one is? It's in Texas. This is Galveston right after Hurricane Ike. So they call this the coastal flooding. It's the effect of tide combined with large amounts of water and waves from storms to make the coastal areas at risk for flooding. There's a lot of factors that go into account whenever they're talking about these, and a lot of it, they take historic data to develop where Zone X stops and Zone A begins, and at what level Zone A has. And it can be from tropical storms, hurricanes, nor'easters. The storm surge is the amount of water combined with the effect of the normal tide that is pushed towards the shore during the storm. The height of the storm surge is driven by a number of variables, and it has to do with the strength and the size of the storm, along with the speed and the direction in which the storm moves. And using the historical storm information, they model prospective storms, future storms. So shallow flooding is one where the water rises because it just simply has nowhere to go. This picture was taken in Junction, Texas in 1935, and it is representative of what a lot of us have seen with flooding, where we say, but we're not really in a flood zone. And it has to be whenever there's just an inundation of rain. It occurs because there is unconfined flows over a broad swath, relatively low area, such as in the plains in West Texas. It happens here. It happened at my own house here in San Marcos, and I'm well above floodplain. They have two different ways of describing this. There's shallow flooding, and that is a result of the meteorological and watershed conditions. And it has to be under 3 feet. So ponding is the result of runoff or flows collecting in one depression where they have really nowhere to go. It could be that they are in culverts, areas where there's a pump station, places where there's a man-made obstruction like a levee or a road fill, railroad grades even, and canal banks. And like I said, they cannot go over 3 feet in depth. Sheet runoff is a broad, it's unconfined downslope movement of water across a sloping terrain, and it's from many sources, including intense rainfall and snowmelt, and where overflow from a channel may cross a drainage area, and it is onto the deltas and plains. There are two different types of mapping. There's the flood hazard boundary map, and that's a fairly general map. It's more original. It's based on approximate data, and it identifies the special flood hazard areas in the community. And then there's the flood insurance rate map. And this is issued following a flood risk assessment conducted in connection with a community that converts over to the National Flood Insurance Program, and that's known as the NFIP. The FIRM, Flood Insurance Rate Map, is the official map of the community that FEMA has delineated where both the special flood hazard areas are and the risk premium zones applicable to the community. So I talked about the National Flood Insurance Program, and this is where the banks actually get their requirement to require a borrower to have flood insurance if the property is located in the flood zone. And the flood insurance program, I guess, can be a double-edged sword in a way. However, because what it does is it can raise the cost of a commercial property to a point where the return on investment no longer makes sense if the flood insurance is so high that the revenues off of the building will not support the purchase price along with the flood insurance. Now, if a community has gone to the trouble of participating in the NFIP, then all of the FEMA restrictions are in place and there's nothing you can do about it. But whenever the community chooses to join, it must adopt and enforce minimum floodplain management standards. And so the FEMA works closely with the state and local officials to identify those hazard areas and the flood risks. One nice thing about it, though, is that the lenders, when they require the flood insurance, there may be a discount, though, to the borrower on the flood insurance premium, and that ranges from 5% to 45%, and that's based on the community CRS class. And their CRS class has to do with their response and their ability to address flooding conditions whenever they occur. So we get to where I originally had my issues. My client had an office building under contract, and it was scheduled to close. He was using third-party financing and had been approved for the loan. About 3 days before the closing, the lender ordered a flood certification from an outside company, and it came back that the property was in the floodplain. Therefore, per the lending requirements, the loan could not be made without flood insurance. The building had never had previous flood insurance, and it was up high on steel pilings, so even though it was raised above a narrow creek, it's obvious that the building itself will never likely be affected by rising water. So the pilings that you see in this picture are actually the building, and it is pretty high up. There is a creek off to the right on that picture, and if you look at my diagram, you can see the line where it says FP per map 590. And so the floodplain was at 590 feet above sea level, and that small section of the building was the only part of the entire property that was actually in the floodplain. So elevating the structure doesn't remove it from the floodplain. And their reasoning is that the ground saturation can change the ability of the building to support itself if the water collects there at the base. So they were going to require flood insurance for the financing. And I'm going to go back one and describe this. Even though only one corner of one building was in the floodplain, both buildings were actually considered in the floodplain, and they could not be separated even though they had separate different addresses because they were connected by a covered walkway.
Okay, Peggy, I'm gonna quick just to point out to everybody that some of this may get hard to follow. It was for me at first. So do bear in mind that if you're listening and you have questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A panel, and I'm keeping a close eye on that if you have questions for Peggy as she goes along. Okay, go ahead, Peggy.
Thank you. So this NFIP was established originally it started out with the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, and then the NFIP came in 94. And it mandates that the federally regulated, supervised, or insured financial institutions and federal agency lenders must require flood insurance for buildings located in a participating NFIP community and in an SFHA, which is the Special Flood Hazard Area. Some of them may still require flood insurance outside of the Special Flood Hazard Area just for their own risk management. So which types of buildings may be insured against flood loss? And it can be written on any building that is eligible for coverage with 2 or more rigid outside walls and a fully secured roof. And so the buildings have to resist flotation, so they probably need to be on a slab or on pier and beam. They need to be resistant to collapse and lateral movement. Manufactured homes can also be covered as long as even travel trailers without wheels, as long as they are on an FHA approved foundation, permanent foundation. And there are a couple of different kinds of properties that are not insurable. And those are buildings that are entirely over water or underground, gas and liquid storage tanks, all types of animal type buildings, wharves, piers, bulkheads, and like greenhouses, things like that are not going to be insurable. So where we went then was we went back to the seller of the property and we said, well, guess what? We need an elevation certificate to file for a LOMA. And he says, oh, great, I have one. So he produced an elevation certificate that he had had completed by an engineer surveyor a couple of years before. And I believe it's dated in 2007 that he had this done. Our buyer was buying this last year in 2016. And he had done it to satisfy his lender. And at the time, the lender only wanted to see the documentation that the structure was above the floodplain and did not require the building to be insured with flood insurance for the loan. So sometime between 2007 and 2016, lender requirements actually changed. And so the insurance was then required where before it apparently was not. So the elevation certificate is needed before the flood insurance policy can be issued. It must be done by a qualified surveyor or engineer. And communities are encouraged to keep elevation certificates that they can get their hands on in their files. However, for any new or substantially improved structures, the community must require the elevation certificate. And at that point, they are required to keep them. I want to point out a couple of things. Here, let's see, I have this pen. Okay, so right here, I want you to notice B9. These are the important parts of this elevation certificate. This is the base flood elevation, and you'll notice it is at 490.5. Now, when I originally called FEMA, they said to tell them what C2 line A was. So I did. It was at 505.30. This is the top of the bottom floor. And so this is at the bottom of the building.
Peggy, you seem to have frozen.
Oh, no.
There you are. Now you're back.
Okay. So the lowest adjacent grade, the lag, it is the lowest adjacent grade next to the building. And the elevation there is 487.3, a full 3 feet below the base flood elevation. So what we had done though was we put together the fermet. This is an actual copy of the fermet that goes to this property. And a fermet is built from the firm, the flood insurance rate map. It's the official map of the community that the FEMA has put on there, again, where the special flood hazard area and the risk premium zones are. And if you can tell, the building was right here in this spot. So from the FEMA website, you can put in the property address. There's a link to create a fermet, and once there, the form has 3 controls for the map: the scale and the panel information, and you can use the hand tool to move the map over the section to print. It can be a little awkward, but I think my next slide shows you basically a screenshot of what you get on the computer when you're on the fermet site. Well, I thought there was. Nope. Okay. So back to our building, and we immediately filed for a letter of map amendment, the LOMA. On a LOMA, there's no filing fee, and it takes between 45-60 days for your determination. When I had called FEMA, the intake assistant asked for the number in B9, and that was this number right here, the 490.5. And then he asked for the number in C2A, the 505.30. And he said, okay, piece of cake. It's 15 feet above the floodplain. No problem. So I was planning to file the letter of map amendment. And what a letter of map amendment is if the applicant and insured believes that the requirement to purchase the flood insurance was made in error, and there is evidence that the building is not in the special flood hazard area on the effective flood insurance rate map, the applicant insured may apply for a letter of map amendment. And then there would be no flood insurance requirement. And so in my case, my client wanted to avoid the flood zone stigma on his building. So we go back to this. This is where the website where you can get this information. In this case, the building itself was above the floodplain, but the piling was in the floodplain. This is the form you use for these letters of map amendment. If there's a total of 6 pages, I've shown you 2 of them, and you can file for the LOMA on this one by checking this box. You can fill these out online and then print them off, but the entire package has to be sent by mail to the FEMA office where they go over these, the mapping, and I think it's in Alexandria, Virginia. And they give you the address on the last page, so you don't have to remember it. It's on there. So you must produce the format and submit with the application along with a copy of the property deed. Okay, so on page 2, you have a checklist of what you need to include. And it says from the tax assessor's map. However, that is applicable, I believe, in other states. In Texas, I tried, the tax assessor doesn't give you a map. So you have to use the survey or the plat where the platting of the subdivision was. If the subdivision was not platted, then you're going to use the original survey on the property and send it in. So you have to have the property deed, the survey, the elevation certificate, and the ferment. I didn't mean to.
Peggy, I'm going to pop in with a question or two. So you said that you had to send all of this information to Virginia. There are no state offices for this. It all has to go to the National FEMA office in Virginia?
That's correct, because that's where the mapping office is, and all of these are asking them to change their mapping.
How long did it take them to review your application?
They were right at just under 60 days.
Okay. And then I have another question here that says, I sell property in the hill country with lots of rivers and creeks. Is there a resource website or packet I can send to clients new to buying land in the floodplain? Maybe we should ask that after you're done with the explanation. We could talk about that.
Yeah, maybe we should put something together.
And then I have another question. Who wants to
There's an opportunity.
There you go. Yes, publishing opportunity right there. Someone wants a review of FIRMET, FIRMETTE, please. Could you go over that definition again? Yes.
Yes.
Lindsay's down with that packet idea, it sounds like.
And I'm looking through on my slides. I could have sworn I had a slide describing how to get the format off of the computer, off of the website.
But what is the format again?
It is, you make your own map. So basically you are going to the FEMA website and you put in the address and it gives you a link of where you can make your map, and you're making a format.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so this is FEMA's rejection letter. It's kind of an insult. And this is them coming back, and they said, nope, it's in flood zone AE, the structure. So what is not removed from the special?
Oop, you've frozen again. Hang on. Okay, hit it.
Are we there?
Yeah.
Okay, so it says what is not removed from the special flood hazard area. The structure is not. Which flood zone is it in? It's in AE. And that the BFE, the base flood elevation, is at 490.5 feet. It is in the 1% annual chance flood elevation, which is also the 100-year floodplain. And they point out that the lowest adjacent grade of the building is 487.3 feet, again, 3 feet below base flood elevation. So whenever you go to the flood risk map, doggone it. Okay. You can see on here, this is my building right here that we had for sale. There are 2 buildings. The only part of this property that is actually in AE in the floodplain is right here, circled around that little corner. And of course it is 15 feet up above the floodplain on pilings, but the piling itself at the bottom, the lowest adjacent grade to the dirt, is at 487.3. So where the piling touches the dirt, that is the elevation of the dirt. So that is what lowest adjacent grade is. I think I personally had a real hard time accepting this. And I tried arguing why this made no sense to me. And all I can tell you is that went on deaf ears. They honestly did not care. And what you'll see here is that the rest of the property is in Zone X.
I have another couple of questions here. Okay, it says, how long did it take to receive determination document? You just said it was right at 60 days.
Right.
They ask if you had to show documentation that the building was not elevated by fill.
Yes, because by fill, that would have been a different application, and that would have been the LOMA F or CLOMA F if it was going to be built. The it's actually I'm sorry, LOMR F, and so whenever you are, so the LOMA is basically your application for a map change stating that the existing structure just simply is not in the floodplain. The C LOMA, the CLOMA, is your application for change based on the building is going to be built, so it's conditional. It's going to be built and it's not in the floodplain. The LOMAR F, the letter of mapping amendment, says that it has been elevated by fill and it is not in the floodplain. And then the conditional LOMR, LOMAR F, means that the building is going to be built with fill and is not going to be in the floodplain. Now, for everything that is not a LOMA, meaning FEMA got it wrong, you have to pay for the application. And so you can see on page 2 that there are various fees depending on your application and how it applies. So what are we going to do about this? This is basically the FEMA map now showing this property, and they show our LOMA application right here. And with further research, you would find that determination letter telling us that there is no change, that it is clearly in the floodplain. So here's what we have. We have this building now. It is above the floodplain. This is, I've given you 2 views of this. However, so here's what we're going to do. To get it out of the floodplain, we're going to put in fill. We're going to build a retaining wall around this edge of the building and then fill in behind it, and that will make the lowest adjacent grade of this piling at 491.5, which is 1 foot above base flood elevation. And if I don't talk about the 1 foot above in a few minutes, remind me to. So we will bring it level up to the 3 feet, but it's going to need to be the extra foot, and then we will file the LOMAR F so that whenever he goes to sell this building, he can get his highest possible price because it will no longer be in the floodplain. Just to go over these again, the LOM-C is the letter that reflects an official revision, and there are different types of LOM-Cs. So there's the letter of map amendment. It's issued when the scale of the firm does not allow for the small areas of naturally high ground to be shown outside of the special flood hazard area. So in other words, FEMA got it wrong. They did not account for variations in topography and that the building was not actually in the floodplain. The conditional letter of map amendment means that it's not going to be elevated by fill, But that after construction, it still would not be in the base flood elevation area, so it would not be in the floodplain. Then there's the letter of map revision based on fill. And this is similar to the LOMA, but instead of it being based on natural ground elevations, the property or structure has been elevated by fill in order to elevate it above the base flood elevation. Then the conditional letter of map revision based on fill is a comment on a letter from FEMA stating that the parcel of land or proposed structure that will be elevated by fill and upon construction would not be in the BFE. And so the parcel then, or the proposed structure, is going to be built outside of that. And then there's the LOMA, which I just went over, and then a conditional letter of map revision, the CLOME-R. So just remember, conditional means it's going to be built, and the other ones, the F, means that it's got filled. This whole section now kind of moves on to no-rise certificates. A no-rise certificate is required if the building is built in the floodway or the floodway fringe, and it could potentially create obstructions to water flow during the flood event. So when I was learning about this is called the big elephant in the room. So and it kind of stuck with me because this is very, sort of complicated. So this diagram is used to illustrate the proposed structure, and that is this building over here, to be built above the flood elevation. So each pillar is going to have to be measured to the direction of the water flow for the total square foot obstruction in the flow path of the flood event. And FEMA requires a buffer of 1 foot above for the effects to downstream flooding. So this is where, if you're going to put it in, and they say that the base flood elevation is, say, 600, you're going to have to go to 601. It must be 1 foot above, and the reason why is because if the water got squeezed up, it would have to show that it could go at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation for them to approve the application. Now, where did they get the 1 foot? That's kind of been one of my questions. It's not exactly arbitrary, but that's where they have determined is the safest zone for new structures. So in this case, each piling is 2 feet wide, a 2 foot diameter, and it's measured with varying heights due to the terrain. The pilings are not measured around because FEMA is only concerned with the side obstructing the water flow. If the pilings were, let's just say, rectangular, and the long side was in line with the water flow, essentially there could be less obstruction with a square or round piling. So the shortest one for purposes of this example are 5 feet, the next one is 10, and the next one is 15 feet, and they're all the same diameter at 2 feet wide. So now imagine that there is a naturally occurring obstruction, such as a tree or multiple trees, that are also in the floodway or the floodway fringe. So in order to receive the no-rise certificate, FEMA requires mitigation of the increase in obstruction to the water flow during the flood event. In our case, our obstruction takes up 60 square feet. They're in the floodway fringe, so they're not in the floodway, but they're in the potential for where flooding could occur. And for purposes of our demonstration, the tree is 25 feet tall by 3.5 feet in diameter. And so it is a total of 87.5 square feet. And just so that y'all have some definitions, BFE again is base flood elevation. The finished floor level is the top of the bottom floor, and that's often on diagrams as FF or FFL. And FEMA requires the base flood elevation plus 1 foot to the finished floor level. going to go back to this. Okay, so what they're saying is that if we are going to build these pilings and create an obstruction to the water flow, something else must be removed that was already there inhibiting water flow. So the tree could be cut down, and that would mitigate the new obstruction from the pilings on the building. I guess that can happen anywhere but Austin. And I don't know what you would take out if you can't take out a tree, but there could be other things that might be an obstruction that were already there that could be removed and offset the new pilings. If you don't receive the no rise certificate, I think you're going to have real problems building the building because you won't be able to get your permit to build it. So on the flood study methods, this came about whenever we were talking about a developer who wanted to build a subdivision, and part of the subdivision was in the floodplain. So some part of the tract was mapped to be in the floodplain. And during his due diligence on his contract, the developer was under the belief that the map might have been in error. So the portion of the FEMA maps in the floodplain seemed incorrect, but he couldn't prove it. But that would mean that if he built houses and they were in the floodplain, of course, he couldn't sell them because the new owner would have to get flood insurance to buy them. FEMA takes in large areas of land, and on the and we discussed this on the FIS slide where they determine the flood hazard area, but they're taking long sections of land and interpolating all of the different variables to come up with where the base flood elevations are. And they could be wrong in small areas. So these areas are really just determined by using statistical analysis and records of river flow, storm tides, erosion, wave heights, and rainfall, and other information that they've obtained through consultation with the community, including floodplain topographic surveys and other types of coastal hydrologic and hydraulic analysis. However, on a smaller lot, they could be off by a few feet, which would mean the difference between being able to develop the land and not. So the developer can appeal the flood zone mapping by conducting what's called a detailed study. And that has to be done by a certified engineer or surveyor, and they have to do an elevation survey and put together other data supporting the amendment to the flood map. So the detailed study is going to include cross sections of the property like this in smaller areas than the FEMA FIS study would have been done in. They're measuring the flow path perpendicular to the anticipated flow of the water. So if the flow is going from left to right, hopefully that's left to right on your screen, then they're taking the cross section of the flow. They're taking channel characteristics and where the changes in slope, shape, and roughness occur, discharge points in the stream, such as the forking off of tributaries that may occur, and any structures, and that could include like bridges and levees, anything else that has been built. And at each one of those points, they've got to take two cross sections, so one on each side. To give you an example of the cost of this, there was a 1,600 acre tract near Seguin that was going to be subdivided for housing development, and the engineer's cost was around $15,000. It could go anywhere from maybe $10,000 to $20,000. And the FEMA review charge was $8,500. So if you're doing this during your due diligence study, it could get pretty expensive. And of course, the developer is going to want to know, he's going to want to have a good idea of how he can come out with this before he undertakes that type of expense during due diligence.
Peggy?
Yes.
If somebody had done a study like this of a particular property before you had gotten to it, would there have been a place you could find that, or are those privately owned documents that nobody has to post?
No, those are all on there. And so when we go back to this, whenever you go to FEMA's website,
Okay.
it will show you right here that there was a LOMA filed. In this case, it might have been a detailed study. It'll give you the number and the effective date. And it's all public record.
Okay, so you could look it up according to that.
That's correct.
Okay. Interesting.
So basically one other point that I was going to make. So the reason you would do this detailed study is your intent is actually to move the floodplain and to have it permanently out of your way. And the only other two things that I'm going to go over are structural modifications to buildings that people may not realize are out there. If the building is already in the flood zone, you can make certain modifications to remediate the risk of flooding the structure. So I don't know if SmartVent is the only company out there, but this happens to be one of them. And once they're installed, they prevent hydrostatic pressure buildup that causes walls to cave in whenever there's a flood event. And this is referred to as wet flood proofing. The other one that I've come across is from PS Barriers, and I think that there are other companies. Their website indicates that they had a flood event in '97 and that they expanded their commercial doors to flood protection and flood barriers. Three that I'm going to point out that I looked at when I was looking at a building. The Easy Dam, and that is this one right down here. It's a lift out option for flood protection, and when the flooding happens, it gives you a real quick response rate. You latch the barrier to the jambs in the front of the opening, and this is a 30-second alternative. And whenever it's not there, you just store the barrier somewhere else. But it is literally that fast, and you just plug it in and pop it in. You lock it in place, and water cannot penetrate. They also have flood planks, and those are right here. So you have a structure that's built outside of your opening, and then these come in 6-inch increments, but they can be at any length that you needed. And the way they fit together, you can put these in place rather quickly and prevent the floodwater from penetrating into the building. And the only other one that I thought was pretty interesting was a permanent flood door. So it's just like a commercial glass door, except that it serves as both the flood protection barrier and it's a regular pedestrian door, so people can walk through it. You lock it just like a commercial door. And that way you prevent water from penetrating. So these are possible options for commercial properties. I found that their range in price was less expensive than I thought they could have been. But just say that the single-use pedestrian door, I think, was around $6,000. Pretty pricey, but if it saves your property from having floodwater coming in, it might be worth it, and it might be worth it for your clients. And that is the end of the presentation. Are there any questions?
I do have one here that asks, how often are the FEMA flood maps revised? Do you know?
I don't know. I think that's going to be a community issue. So once the community joins the NFIP, I think if there's changes, then they're the ones who are going to initiate response from FEMA. And of course, they're revised with every one of the LOMAs or CLOMAs that are filed in application.
Did you get an idea of whether or not filing a LOMA or one of the other requests to change the floodplain whether having one rejected affected the likelihood that you could get it changed later, or do they seem to look at each request discreetly?
I believe they look at each one discreetly. From what I found when I talked to them, somehow I wiggled my way through the intake person and straight to the guy in mapping. And so in our case on the building where we filed the LOMA and it got rejected, I really don't have any fear from talking to him that if we end up doing the LOMA, that it would be rejected, because then we would have made a change.
Okay.
And basically they look at numbers. They look at two numbers: base flood elevation and lowest adjacent grade. Those are the only two you actually need to care about. So the one about where the base elevation of the bottom floor is, you actually don't need that building. That number only comes into effect when you're talking to the insurance agent. Okay.
Interesting. All right. We do have time for any more questions. Somebody might want to type in. Lindsay wants to know, do you offer more questions about floodplains and real estate? Somebody asked if we will have slides to refer to. Yes, I will post these slides on the commercial webinar page. To answer a little bit of that question before I hand that one over to Peggy, our next month's webinar is going to be Joshua Oyer, who is from the Texas Water Development Board. He's going to come in here and he's going to do a webinar on the NFIP as a whole. So he's going to talk about the mappings and things like that, and might be able to answer questions like how frequently do they revise the flood maps and things like that. So, but Lindsay asks you, Peggy, do you offer more classes about floodplains and real estate?
I would love to.
She's the floodplain lady.
This has gotten to be my signature issue.
So how has this changed how you approach selling a property that's in an area like the Hill Country? Do you do anything different now that you know all about this?
Yes. So now, I think before going into this, I looked at the building, saw it was way up high on pilings. No problem. Even though it was next to a creek, I think inherently I had sort of felt like, because the property was outside of the floodplain, or I felt like it was outside of the floodplain, no way it was ever going to get flooded, it shouldn't be a problem. Now, whenever you really realize, okay, unless they're a cash buyer, if there is one brick on the side of the building inside the floodplain, the entire property is considered to be in the floodplain. And they cannot get lending, they can't get funded by a commercial lender unless they purchase flood insurance. I had heard about a building in Houston that the buyer was a willing buyer. The property had not been in the floodplain until Hurricane Ike. And during Hurricane Ike, everything in downtown Houston flooded. So the building was $50 million. It was huge. It was one of the big high rises. They had a buyer for it. The buyer qualified for his lending. He had his down payment. And then they went for the flood certificate, just like my buyer did. And the flood certificate came back that it was now in the floodplain and that it had to meet flood insurance requirements for the loan. They couldn't qualify anymore. The flood insurance was going to be $500,000 a year. The building wasn't throwing off enough money for him to be able to qualify. Ultimately, what I was told, the building sold, but it was because the seller came down on the price and made it doable so that he could justify the additional cost and actually qualify for a lower loan. But I don't take it for granted anymore. And so even though I personally have always had a rule, never buy anything in the floodplain, I felt like if it was above the floodplain, it was pretty safe, and it's not.
Definitely have to do some checking. Somebody here asks about the difference between a floodway and a floodplain.
Okay, so the floodplain is any area in there, any area where it's in the flood zone. So the floodway and the floodway fringe are two different areas. So the floodway is the direct area where the water is going to be flowing. The floodway fringe is as the water rises, it's going to fill in that little triangular area. But the floodway and the floodplain is all inclusive.
Okay. Someone asks, do you recommend avoiding buying acreage in a floodway? What type of use other than ag is suitable for a floodway?
Well, if you file for your fill, then it's doable. So this goes back to the other question, where how do I approach this differently? My philosophy had always been, I personally stay away from anything in the floodplain. Now I won't necessarily do that, because now I know that there are ways to get around it if you put in fill, or you build up a retaining wall and you build it outside. You change where the flood zone is by building your base flood elevation up above it by its amount plus 1 foot. Don't forget the 1 foot.
1 foot. That 1 foot is key. If we ever change over to metric system, I wonder what they'll use instead of a foot. Does anybody else have any questions for Peggy before we wrap up? Last call. No? All right. I'll say a few closing remarks. And
thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Peggy. We really appreciate this. Peggy had some hard-won personal knowledge, and it was great. I've learned a lot just listening to her. Again, if you guys want to review this material, one last question. I just want to make sure. Okay, somebody says, that was great, thanks. We will have a recording and the slides on the commercial webinars page on the TAR website. Also, if you would like Peggy to come to your firm or to your local board and do this presentation live for you for CE credit, we can certainly make that happen. You can reach Peggy at her information that's here on the slide, or you can get hold of me at TAR. Just call us here and ask for Amy, and I can help get you set up for that. And another reminder that next month will be more flood information. And looking at the weather here in Austin, it seems like that might be a good topic. We will have, again, Joshua Oyer from the Water Development Board to give us a macro view of the flood insurance program. The CE credit for that is pending. We've applied for it, so hopefully you will be able to get that for CE credit too. CE credit, someone's asking, how do we get CE credit? You have to be in a proctored location, such as your local board. Whenever you hear about these webinars, you want to watch them for CE credit, you need to get hold of your local board and ask them to hold that there. You can't just do it from home, because there has to be somebody that you get the applications and they mark you present and all that good stuff. So that looks like that wraps up all our questions and everything. Peggy, thanks very much again. I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll do it for CE next month.